let's now use the user account page in order to allow users to update their data. So what we're going to do is to allow the user to update both the name and the email address for now. And we will add the user photo here a bit later in the next section. Okay? Now there are two ways in which we can do this. The first one is to submit a post request to our API, just like we did with the login form. Remember that? And actually we're going to do that in the next lecture. But in this one, I want to show you another way, which is a more traditional and normal way. So in this more traditional way, we specify the post method right on the form, along with the URL where the post request should be sent to. So basically, using this method, we don't need JavaScript for doing the request. It automatically happens with the HTML form, which will then post the data to the URL endpoint in our backend that we specified. Now, personally, I don't really like this solution because it forces a page reload, and it also requires us to create yet another route and route handler in our backend. And finally, it also makes it a bit more difficult to handle errors. However, I still believe that it's very important that you know how to work with forms in this way, because it might make more sense in the application that you're building. For example, your application might not even need an API, and so in that case, when you're only building a rendered website, then of course it doesn't make sense to submit forms using an API call. And instead, you will do it the way that we're going to do it in this video. Alright? And so that's why we're doing it this way in this lecture, and then using the API way in the next lecture. So what we need to do in our form in order to submit it automatically without having to go through JavaScript, as I mentioned before, so basically automatically posting the data to our endpoint, is to specify that endpoint. And so we do that here in the form, where we specify the action attribute. So the action, and so let's say that we're going to create an endpoint called submit user data, like this, okay? And then we also specify the method, which is post, okay? So this always needs to happen on the form element that we are submitting, okay? Let's give it some more space here in order to make it easier to understand. And so all of this here is our form. And so when we click on this button element, automatically the form will get submitted and the data will be sent using a post request to this URL. Alright? There are also different ways in which the data is actually sent, but the default one is called URL encoded, and so that's the one we're using here. And so basically what that's going to do is to encode all the data that we're submitting in the URL, a bit like a query string. Okay? But more on that when we are actually working on getting the data on the server and working with it. So this here is the first step in making this method work, and the second one is to specify the name properties on the fields that we actually want to send. So it's this input, and their values will be sent with a request based on their name attributes. Okay? So let's say here name equals to name, okay? So that's the user name, and then this one here will have the name equal to email. Okay, and so this will then be the name of this field and the body that our application receives. All right, and so right now when we submit the form, the body that we will then receive will only have the name and the email, because these are the only two fields which actually have a name attribute. All right, so let's now implement this route here. Okay. So as I said, with this method, we need to implement yet another route. Okay, so router, and remember that this is a post request. Okay, and so this one will be in views controller, and let's say update user data. All right, give it a save. And now let's actually create this handler. So here in this file, And the first thing that I want to do here is to actually take a look at the body. .body. Okay, and so basically in this case, just to show you that it actually won't work just like this. Okay, and I'm going to tell you why after we experiment it. Okay, so for now, let's just see if we're actually connected already. So if submitting that form will actually trigger this handler here. Okay, let's also add a string here just to make sure. All right, so let's reload this here so that we get our new form. And just to make sure, let's take a look at that. All right, so you see here the action and the method that we added, and of course also these names. Okay, and so let's like add some middle name here. I don't know, let's say Sarah. And then here the email, let's add the last name to it. Now we get this error, please provide email and password. And so this kind of comes from the login form, right? So that's weird. So let's take a look at our form here. And indeed, this form here has the form class. And I think that's the one that we used also in our index.js. Right? So here, we basically got that form using the form class. And when that exists and it is submitted, then we try to log in right here. Okay? And so that is of course not correct. And so we should select our login form in some other way. So let's very quickly fix that. Here we have login. So let's just add another class here, form login. And that's a bit weird because we already have login form here, but it's not really on a form element. So we shouldn't use that. And so let's create here form with a modifier of login. Okay. So let's put that here, give it a save. And so now this should no longer be happening because now we no longer have that event handler attached to this form. So let's quickly reload it again and try this again. And now you see that it's actually doing something. But of course, it will never stop spinning here because we actually did not send any response back. And so the request response cycle is never ended. But anyway, I just wanted to look at the request body. Remember that? And so, as I mentioned before, it's now actually empty. Okay, so as I was saying, this will not really work just like this because we need to add another middleware in order to parse data coming from a form. So let's do that in our app.js. But first, let's actually close some of these files here. All right. This one as well. And now going to app.js, let's add that close to our body parser. So here we are, because actually it is very similar. So app.use, and it's still a Express built-in middleware. So express.url encoded. Okay, and it's called this way because remember, the way that the form sends data to the server is actually also called URL encoded. And so here we need that middleware to basically parse data coming from an URL encoded form. Then we pass in some settings and we can say extended true, and that will simply allow us to pass some more complex data, which in this case is not really necessary, but still let's use it here. And we can also set the limit property as we did in the body parser, so up here. And so let's again say 10 kilobyte. All right. And so if we try this now again here, we should indeed get this data and this data. Let's again add this different data here. So just so we're sure that we're actually getting not the current user, but really the data coming from the form. Okay. And again, it keeps spinning forever here or until it times out. But what we're interested in is to actually get this new data here now in our body. Great, so that works. And so we now have our HTML form really connected to this route handler here. And so now we can go ahead and actually update the user based on this new data. All right, so let's get rid of this and then update the user as we already know how to do it. Now, first of all, we're going to have to import the user model. So let's do that. User, here with a small u. All right. And so now let's say the user is equal to await user dot find by ID and update, right? Then of course, as always, mark this one as async and catch all the errors. All right. So what is the ID that we're looking for? And I hope that at this point you know where it is. It will be at request.user.id. Oh, and one important thing that we need to do, which I didn't do yet, is to actually protect this route here as well. Okay? Because only then we actually have this user on the request, right? And of course also, we only want to be able to access this route if we are logged in. Otherwise, anyone could simply go ahead and update some data. So here in the route, let's of course add the auth controller dot protect. All right. So that is the ID. Then we need the new data. And so let's say that we want the name equal to request.body.name and the email set to request.body.email. And remember that these are the names of the fields because we gave them the name attribute in the HTML form. Remember? Now before, when we updated some data, we used to pass in the entire request here into the update method, right? But in this case, we really only want to update the name and the email. And so like this, we are sure that anything else basically is being stripped away from the body. Because some hacker could of course now go ahead and add some additional fields to the HTML and then, for example, submit data like password and stuff like that. And so of course, we do not want to store that malicious data into our database, right? Also, passwords are once more handled separately, because remember that we can never update passwords using find by ID and update. Again, because that's not going to run the safe middleware, which will take care of encrypting our password. Okay? And so that's why we have a separate route for that in our API, and also we have a separate form for that in our user interface. And so usually that's what you always see in web applications, where when you want to update your password, you usually have a separate form only for that. Okay? Anyway, let's now continue here with our options, where we say that we want to get the new, so basically the updated document as a result, and also that we want to run the validators. So this is just like we did it before in our API. Great. So let's actually call it updated user. Okay, and so what do we want to do now? Well, after submitting the data on our website, basically what we want is to simply come back to this page here, but of course then with the updated data here. Okay, so that's easy. All we will have to do is to basically render the account page again. And so that's similar to this one. Let's just copy it. Okay, but now there's actually one important difference, because right now we actually also need to pass in the user. So the updated user, because otherwise the user that the template is going to use is the one that's coming from the protect middleware. Remember? And so that one is not going to be the updated user. Right? And so we need to pass in user is updated user. All right? And so that should be enough. So if we now reload this, or actually if we now save this here, then you see that we actually came back to the exact same page and the data is still the same. So let's prove that. Go to some other page and then go back to the settings page. And so this proves that the data has now effectively been updated. So if we now log out, then let's try to log in with this new email. So I wanted to log out. All right, and now log in again. And so now we're going to use this new email. And of course, still the old password, test1234. And indeed, this is now the new email address that we need to use in order to log in. Now let's just see what happens when we pass in some wrong data here. For example, Google Chrome allows us to submit an email address like this. But of course, our Mongoose model does not allow an email with this format. And so we should now get an error. And so indeed, we get this error, please provide a valid email. But that's kind of a terrible user experience, right? So we were just submitting our data, and then all of a sudden we went to a completely new page. And actually we see that we also got to this new URL, so the one where we submitted the data to. And so, yeah, that's a bit terrible. And so as I was saying right in the beginning, this way of doing things is actually a bit worse for handling errors, which is one of the reasons why I personally prefer to use the API that we already created in order to update the user data and in general to do this kind of stuff. All right? So let's actually do exactly that in the next video.